So, hi everybody, thank you for being here. As there is no screen, what I propose, even if it's not the framework, is to introduce ourselves a little bit. So maybe we can start with you, Pierre.
Sure. So yeah, thank you all for being here. My name is Pierre. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Open Classrooms, which is a Paris-based startup company in online education. What we do is basically offer degree programs from the education to employment on tomorrow's skills and digital jobs mostly, so bachelor's or master's degree on web development or data science and digital marketing. It's a startup company of about 100 people, and we train roughly 3 million students a month.
Right, so I'm Sebastian. I'm co-founder and CEO of TWIC. TWIC that actually stands for The World is a Campus. We actually interconnect business schools around the world by enabling them to share academic content, co-develop teaching materials, and create a global network of peer students and faculty across schools and around the world. So as of today, as I say to my friends here, we started gaining traction in the US, as paradoxical as it sounds, because we had a strong partnership with Yale University that has this vision to create a broad network of schools around the world. And they wanted basically to have a technology that would allow this cross-institutional approach, and this is what we do today, and we allow them to have partners around the world within the same platform.
I'm so impressed to talk in front of so many people in San Diego. I'm Benjamin, I'm co-founder of Beneylu. We have an online platform for elementary classrooms in the impossible French K-12 market. In Beneylu School, our main product, classrooms can do everything they need to do, from working, obviously, homework, collaboration between kids, publishing, communication with parents, etc.
Great. My name is Alex Spiro. I'm the managing partner of Brighteye Ventures, the leading EdTech fund in Europe. We're a 50 million euro fund that invests at seed and Series A, and we really look at the pan-European EdTech scene, but being based in Paris, we look at lots of French EdTech deals and are very clued into to the startup scene and the ecosystem in France. So hopefully I can shed a little bit of light on the sort of broader picture.
Hi, I'm Pierre-Eric Leibovici, co-founding partner of a brand new VC fund called Daphni. We manage around $200 million. We invest all over Europe, and we are sector agnostic. And our target deals with seed and Series A round. So our mission today is to talk about the French Revolution. So we could start by explaining why France is a good country to invest at the present time. I can give you a few information about the amounts that are invested in France today. It's about 2 billion in 2016. It's an increase of 40% as compared to 2016, and it should be around 3 billion in 2018. What it means is that we are the second most active country in Europe after England. And the French Revolution is today emphasized by the election of Macron and all the positive framework he tries to organize in order for France to be very competitive. His idea is to create a startup nation, so we will explain later maybe what is a startup nation. And he took part to a number of initiatives, including the opening of the biggest incubator in the world called Station F. The objective is to gather about 5,000 entrepreneurs in the same place. There are some very well-known corporates, including Facebook, Google, Microsoft, being part of this project. last but not least, what we observe at the present time in France is that we've got a lot of entrepreneur and startupper coming from all over Europe, but also from the US, who want to either start their business or join an existing business because they think it's a good time, and they're right. We have a very mature ecosystem with serial entrepreneurs. A lot of successful of them are launching new projects. So it's a good time to invest in tech for sure in France, and let's see if it's the same thing regarding the EdTech sector. But first, what I would propose is to have an opinion on the French tech arena, and probably if one of you or several of you would like to complete what I said, it would be great.
Yeah, I mean, what I can add to this is that, of course, Paris is very well famous everywhere in the world, but there are also other places in France, and the previous government created a label called French Tech label, and it actually is awarding cities around the country, a dozen of cities that have this ecosystem of startups. Personally, I'm not from Paris. I'm from the southeast of France, so it's like the European Silicon Valley, the French Silicon Valley called Sophia Antipolis, and in this area there's a strong cluster for startups and a strong link between corporations and the universities and also investment funds. And so I guess it's pretty well spread around the country now. So yeah, I would definitely say that it's a right moment to invest in France and have partners everywhere in the countries, and each ecosystem everywhere, I mean, regionally have their own specificities. So on top of Paris, there are other places too.
Yeah, I mean, just to shed some light on the EdTech sector in France. Currently, there are about 350 active companies in the EdTech space, startups in France. And over the last year, around 40 million euros was invested in EdTech companies in France. So that's a threefold increase from 3 years previously. And what's interesting to note is that the size of the rounds has increased. The number of deals has remained roughly flat over the last year. But actually the amounts that have been invested have increased significantly. And within the broader spectrum of EdTech in Europe, what you're seeing is very much the same thing. It's not necessarily the case that more EdTech deals are being made. It's more the case that more capital is being devoted to a similar number of EdTech deals. And obviously, what that shows is an increasing willingness on behalf of investors to put significant bets on EdTech companies. And we're not just talking about specialist investors. We couldn't be, in fact, because there are only 3 specialist investors in Europe currently focused on the EdTech market, and we're one of them. We're talking about generalist investors. We're talking about investors like Daphni and Balderton and Octopus and Nordic Makers, and so we're talking about large funds that have profiles who are looking at EdTech deals and seeing opportunities and potential. So I think it's quite promising, actually.
And what are the 2 other funds that are exclusively focused on the EdTech sector in France?
The 2 other funds, you're forcing me to say them, and I just
Yeah,
don't want to. No,
you should.
Okay. So the 2 other funds are Edu Capital, which is also based out of Paris, and there's also Edvinca, which is based out of London. And Edvinca invests at a slightly earlier stage, and Edu Capital invests around the same stage as us. And we love them, obviously, and we get along very well with them. So.
And so, from a macro perspective, do you think that the EdTech sector is deep enough to have specialists, or how do you see the market being organized? We observe in the US very big player. Do you think that it will be possible to have cross-border players in Europe being created in Europe, or there is a risk to see a US player dominate?
I mean, if I can shed some quick light on it, from my perspective, the way that I see it is that the US, larger players in the US would prefer to work with partners in Europe or to acquire interesting startups in Europe than to try and build the market from the ground up, because it's so complicated. And to answer your other question, I think that there are definitely opportunities for cross-border sort of growth stories. It just depends on what the product and service is and how easy it is to localize that product or service, because the key challenge in Europe is, really is localizing not just linguistically but culturally, the products and services. It's not a homogeneous market. It's a fragmented, sort of heterogeneous market. So, but I mean, it would be interesting to hear.
What are the specificities of the European market and the French one more specifically?
So I'd say the education market and the vocational training market in Europe are both highly regulated, and local regulations will vary from one country to the other. So there's a lot of localization involved and a lot of compliance involved. So the entry barriers are pretty high, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And most companies probably start working on K-12 education, so primary and secondary school level kind of education. And this is probably like the toughest market you can think of. There's no clients, there's no sales, more or less. So it's a really hard market. But I would say that entrepreneurs in Europe and especially in France are somewhat more socially driven and mission driven. And so education is a very attractive market to them to really kind of change the world. But it's also one of the toughest markets to penetrate. So it's hard to really crack that nut and to get large enough to then do cross-border sales and move into other European countries. The good thing out of that is that actually, like you said, US companies have a hard time getting in and doing it themselves because high entry barriers, so that means a high defensibility model as well. So usually they come in by local players, but most of the players in Europe and in France are rather small. So you really need to kind of cherry pick and try to integrate several players to really have kind of a European spread.
And Sebastian, you're leveraging on, Benjamin, you are leveraging on the specificities of the French market and organization. Yeah. Do you think that you would be in a position one day to expand outside of France because there's the same kind of barrier in the other countries, or?
I hope so. I hope we can go cross-border. I agree with Pierre, because there is a French market because we have schools. We have K-12 schools like anywhere else. I don't think there is a European market because languages are different, cultures are different, regulations are different. So we have this small market. Europe is not US. You have equal people in Europe and US, but that's not a unified market, Europe. You can't come to Europe. You go to France, you go to UK, you go to Germany, but you can't go to Europe. For us, in the K-12 market, we are in K-5 market. That's a small segment of K-12. I think we can go international because every primary schools are practically the same. You have 5 to 12 years children needing to learn how to count, how to read, how to write. They are in this single school, in a single classroom, in a single room, with a single teacher, with a single group of friends. And you can see that in every country. So it looks like a B2C market for a classroom. So we think we can succeed outside of France because we have the toughest market in the world, I think.
Why? What are the items you are leveraging on at the present time in France and which are really tough?
you have to be resilient in France because market is small. We have no money. It's been 137 years that school is free and mandatory in France. So we have designed schools for poor people, and we have a poor school. We have no money at school. We let money outside the schools, and school is free, and kind of extremism say it has to be free. So you let no money enter in the schools. That's the French system, French model. And we survived in this environment. So we know how to work with low money, with a lot of energy. We need to understand what is a classroom, elementary classroom. How does it work? And I think it's a big difference between us and many American products with this big market full of money when you can just put a quiz online and that's a big success. You can succeed with that in France, I think. So I don't know. I don't remember the question.
What did you leverage that's specific to France? So, I mean, for example, I believe that you used some of the government initiatives to spread EdTech in France to your advantage, didn't you?
People think that. That's not true.
Okay.
Okay, you can't rely on French government for EdTech. They don't spend money. They don't give money to schools. So why are they here? They're here to regulate. They do. They do. You have no chain of commandments. Who's the boss? Who decides? Who can say that in the French market? I don't. I don't think somebody can. So you have to be smart. You have to be, what is the word for malin?
Savvy or...
Voilà.
Savvy, yeah.
I can't explain that better.
Okay.
I'll bring something positive a little bit.
Food is good, wine is excellent.
Yeah. And we have strong, very good business schools in France. I mean, they're not much compared to the US. I can give you like 50 good business schools in France. If you compare to the US, of course, there's nothing to do. Around New York area, there's more than 200, business schools. So in terms of scale, it's very different, but still, they are very innovative. The markets between France and the US, I will give you a bit of context. Business schools are part of comprehensive universities in the US. In France, they are autonomous. They have autonomy financially, even though it depends on several schools. It depends, but still, I mean, we can potentially deal quite easily with the schools. However, the thing is that they are not early adopters. But France is not a country of being early adopters in technology, and I believe it's not the case in EdTech. But the schools have a strong interest in technology. However, they created incubators in HEC, ESSEC, EDEC for the Nice region. So there are some positive inputs at this level. So I'll be quite optimistic, but in terms of business, I would say it's easier paradoxically for a French tech company to get traction in different countries outside of France, and then come back to France and perhaps thanks to the credential you get outside, have some traction in your own country. But it starts with outside first, I mean, as far as I know, from my point of view.
So Pierre, we have to talk about the French Revolution. We explained that for sure there is a good momentum in the tech arena. What is the EdTech revolution that takes place at the present time in France?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the tech revolution, not the EdTech revolution. So in Paris right now, it's getting really easier to attract non-French profiles like British, American profiles who are coming in because or thanks to Brexit, Trump, whatever, for whatever reasons. But it's getting easier and easier to create a global company out of Paris. It was not the case, I think, a couple of years ago. So this is pretty good. there's more capital. So the whole tech scene in Paris is getting some really obvious traction. And on the education side, so I'd say the K-12 market is still really, really hard. So to be honest, it's not much you can do, to be clear. But I think there's a huge opportunity on other markets, such as higher education, business schools, universities, engineering schools, but also vocational training. And actually, the vocational training market in France is one of the largest vocational training markets in the world. It's 32 billion euros a year. It's highly subsidized, so every company, every employer has to actually pay a tax on their payroll, and all that is reused as common resources to pay for vocational training programs and apprenticeship programs for the general population and job seekers. And right now, actually, Macron is passing a new law to make it a bit more fluid, let's say, and a bit more accessible to new companies and startup companies, and to give more of those resources back to the individuals themselves. So I think there are some huge opportunities, and the market will change quite deeply in the next couple of years. That, especially that vocational market, will deeply change, and the actual players are somewhat old-fashioned and somehow monopolies, and they will probably struggle in the new world in just a couple of years. So I think there are huge opportunities right now in France on vocational training and higher education. That's different on K-12, I would say.
Alex, do you share this vision, and what are the sectors you are more focused on as an investor at the present time?
Yeah, so I mean, we have to be as broad with our sort of net of ed tech as possible to really to have access to the best investments in learning technologies. But what I do see in France is that, and it sort of echoes what Pierre has said, which is that I think around 50% of investments in ed tech go into higher education or lifelong learning, and I think the split is 20 to K-12, and then it's 30 to
corporate training.
To corporate training, yeah. So I think there's I think it kind of echoes that. I mean, from our perspective, you know, we see lots of opportunities in the B2C space, because where infrastructure is difficult to integrate products into, or where you have you know, issues with localization, you can often leapfrog those issues with a direct-to-consumer model. On the corporate training side, again, there are lots of opportunities because really corporates look very much the same wherever they are. So if it's a linguistic barrier, that's something that you can overcome. Culturally, most corporations operate in very similar ways. So if you can create a product in corporate learning that is competitive in general in corporate learning, whether you're a French startup or a UK startup, then theoretically you can expand it throughout Europe. So I think for us, we're obviously looking for great companies and great entrepreneurs. We do see the struggles of the K-12 space. There are certainly plays in France, you know, in the Nordics and the UK, but it would be wrong to say at this stage that we are focus on investing specifically in buckets of ed tech to the exclusion of others. We're really taking quite an open view of things.
And perhaps talking about market opportunities, would the new French Revolution include as well the French-speaking countries? and the opportunity in Africa, for example. And I guess, Pierre, you have something to do about this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we are deeply involved in the francophone markets, so especially in Africa. So it's going to be a huge opportunity. So roughly 500 million people will be French-speaking in just a couple of years, and that will all come out for Africa. And in terms of higher education and vocational training and competency-based programs, there's a huge opportunity, and nobody seems to really care about it. There are very few players in Africa in EdTech, in higher ed and in vocational training. So there are things to do. So if I take the example at Open Classrooms, we've got roughly 500,000 students in Africa every month. The usage is really high and growing. Monetization is definitely tougher, and yeah, the market is still not that deep. So we can see the opportunity long term, but short term it's pretty hard. And I think you need to find a way to collaborate with international employers and with the local government as well, and that makes it pretty tricky. That's going to take a while, but I think anybody who is here, yeah, I mean, they're in Africa right now, and for the next couple of years, we'll probably reap the benefits in 5 years or 10 years, and that's going to be huge.
We have some very good engineers in France. Some big companies like Facebook, Samsung are settling their part of their team in the AI environment in France. Do you see any deep tech, edtech companies in France, or we are still very focusing on service providers and enabler? But
yeah, I mean, there's a company called Demosio which is looking at how to leverage AI for personalization, and they're one of only 2 companies in Europe that are looking to do this. So essentially, they're API startups. So there's Demosio and Sana Labs. Sana Labs is, I think, based out of London, and Demosio is based out of Paris. And there's certainly a lot of AI talent in Paris and in France in general. So I mean, that's the first example that comes to mind. And actually, those 2 companies are trying to. They have an approach to personalization which we haven't seen in any US companies. Very often in an edtech startup, the sort of personalization engine will be built within the startup itself. And what these guys are trying to do is to develop an API so that they can essentially work with any edtech startup, so that any edtech startup can use their API and their machine learning algorithms to develop more honed personalization tools. So, I mean, that's the one example that comes to mind. But I think that, as you say, where there's engineering talent, there's always opportunity for developing deep tech, and it's only a matter of time.
I hear a lot of speeches about deep tech, AI in education. I didn't see any proof yet. So I need to see proof. And also, I think in elementary schools, you don't have to be innovative with technology, because if you want to have this big impact in all classrooms, you have to be state-of-the-art for teachers. They have to know how to use your product without any formation, courses, or specific training. So state-of-the-art is good, and maybe a little too high already. So deep tech in elementary, I need to see. I didn't see it already. I don't know.
We talked earlier about education in France as being very public. Do you think that there will be a move to a privatization of the education, and so the problem of monetization and so on will be more easy to solve? So there is one for sure at the corporate level. What about the K-12?
In primary, in these 2 years, we count it's 1,000 new private primary schools in the country. That's huge for France. Everybody's trying. Everybody's trying to build his perfect, ideal school, very Palo Alto school in France. But how to scale that? We have 1 million teachers in France in K-12. We have maybe 1,000 innovative schools with children already privileged. Because if your parents put you in that schools, you're already a privileged children. So what's the point? I think that a lot of money will come to public systems in schools. Because in France, we have these unique systems where you have 24,000 cities financing their schools their own way. 24,000 way to do the budget for the schools. It has to change. And I think that French Education Ministry will take that problem and solve it. And we really need that. So privatization for now for already privileged children, and it will stop, I think, in 5 or 6 years.
When you say cities, you mean municipalities, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex.
No problem.
I learned English in school.
Yeah, I mean, for the business schools, there's this trend to separate the investment of the Chambre de Commerce with the business schools. So it's getting a little more, even more private. Depends where. In Paris, is still, can debate this, but in many parts of France, that's the way it's going to be. So I mean, there's no complex in the business school world in France to buy technology, and it's something very positive. But once again, in terms of culture and mentality, we're not early adopters. The technology has to be proven outside of the country, and then, I mean, the adoption will follow. This is what I believe. But things are changing once again, so towards much more private initiatives within business school, but also private schools like Schools 42 that has a 42 school in the US as well, in Fremont, California. So yeah, it's getting that way for sure.
Pierre, you have one of the most successful EdTech companies in France, at least, and maybe in Europe. How do you explain this success, and what are the ingredients that made this success and your current scaling? And maybe it's part of the French Revolution. It helped.
I don't know about that, but that took us a long time to arrive there because of the entry barriers. So yeah, it took us like 5 years from startup to scale up. But before, we were actually doing that since like 1999, since we started in middle school to create free online courses and publish them for some friends and then friends of friends. And we did that as a hobby for over 10 years prior to studies. And at the end of that era, we already taught roughly 100,000 students a month. So this is probably when we realized that something was going on when we were students in more college education, and actually our fellow students were following our own courses on openclassrooms.com, and our own teachers were actually referring our Open Classrooms courses as part of their courses. So this is when we realized we could actually make it probably a business and something more scalable and make it a global company. I think there's still that kind of class selling in France in the EdTech market. So most companies are very small, actually below probably $1 million in revenue. It has to change, obviously, if we want to create scale-up companies, and especially if you want European leaders, that has to change. But to answer your question, it's really about grit, I'd say. You can give up. If you don't give up, then at some point, most of our competitors are inexistent or dead. So this is just the way it works because of the very high entry barriers, which creates, again, strong defensibility in our own markets. So we are actually right now a very strong leader in French-speaking countries, and the market is very deep, and we have no competition.
And what about the? I think that you are an educational institution as well, so you're able to award degrees and diplomas.
Yes, that's right. So it took us a while again, but we became a higher education institution endorsed by the French state with degree awarding powers. So that makes it pretty unique because we're probably the only or some of the only EdTech companies in the world, startup companies in the world to have degree awarding powers. So we can award associates, bachelor's, and master's degrees to a student in a fully online manner. And that is a huge difference at the end of the day, because when you talk to American students and you tell them you can have an actual academic degree versus you can have that badge or that certificate, the offering is really more compelling. But again, it's not very easily replicable in other countries, even though we are actually building accreditation in the US and in the UK as well. But I think the fact that the accreditation process in France is probably one of the hardest to go through. So when you've done that, you can go anywhere in the world. It seems easy, So when we're trying to enter the UK and we realize that their process is so transparent and fast, and there's only one player and only one accreditation body and only one ministry overlooking the world market, it's unbelievable and makes it so easy,
So you become toughened and hardened in France, and then you conquer the world.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Got it.
I think a reason why it's so long in France, you really have to build trust. In France, we have this phrase, le problème c'est que, problem is. All the sentences begin by problem is. I have a list of objections. I can fill the Padre Stadium with it. With GDPR coming now, the list is increasingly growing and growing and growing. And you have to give proof of what you say. So it's the main reason why it's so long. It's very, very long to build trust with your French public clients. And since you're a private company, you can be seen as evil by teachers, by the institutions. So maybe it can take 5, 6, 7 years to build trust with these people. It's very long.
You can see the difference between a presentation made by American people and French people. I really wanted them to be very optimism, the French Revolution, we are so good. And we are so honest, intellectually speaking, that we are talking about problem. But I can guarantee you, if you come to France at the present time, there is a very good momentum and dynamism. So. What about the European level? How do you see France, and how do we position as compared to the other European countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the talent perspective, I think that you compete certainly very easily with everywhere in Europe, and I can speak for the EdTech space, and I'm not a generous investor, but I think that the struggle that you have is really distribution in France. And you know, as we said, it's not so much of a problem in the corporate space, but K-12 and universities, it is a big problem. Device penetration is relatively low. Broadband penetration is relatively low in educational institutions. In the Nordics and in the UK, it's close to 90%. You know, so you do see edtech startups in the Nordics and in the UK scaling their products nationally, going past minimum viable product, going to first customers, proving out the business model, and then essentially readying themselves for international expansion. That process is faster in an ecosystem where the groundwork is there for you to scale the product nationally. In France, I believe that we'll get to the same stage, but not now, maybe in sort of 5 years or so, we'll be at the same stage where you have 90% device penetration, 90% digital, broad high-speed broadband penetration in schools. And then you're going to find that distribution is a little bit easier. But I think that what I see in France that I think is very remarkable is the intelligence of founders, the talent of people in the companies, the engineering talent as well, which is really remarkable, and also the hyper focus on product. The French are extremely good at developing very high quality products, and so really the issues with scaling an edtech startup in France are not the fault. They're not the fault of the startups in France. They're the fault of the ecosystem and of the distribution mechanisms, I would argue. And so really, it's up to the government, I think, to invest resources in solving that problem, and they're starting to. So I'm hopeful that things will improve.
And to come back on the internationalization of your business, so Sebastian, you decided to go abroad very quickly. But from a general perspective, do you think that there are more potential to address the Francophone countries and the 500 million or 600 million people you were talking about, Pierre? Or to be global day one and to try really to penetrate any kind of markets?
Yeah, well, historically, I mean, it was our spirit from day one to be international in our DNA. We wanted to live in France because we love our country and be able to scale from France. And there was an opportunity to do so. So we intellectualized the whole process, being global at day one. But for sure, there are some, emerging markets that are very powerful and attractive today. We see it personally. I mean, our company, we see it in Southeast Asia. We see it in Latin America, but we saw it also in Africa, English-speaking countries and French-speaking countries. Technically, where the American giants are not present, basically, like Blackboard and Instructure, Canvas. So yeah, to answer your question, we want it to be global, and we think it's a good bet to start from France. We can do it. Although I would argue that if you want to scale in higher education, and especially with business schools, this is what I deeply believe. I believe we also need a foot in the US, and this is what we're going to do now. Because the market is huge. For us, it's 60% of the total market. The major accreditation bodies like ASU are Americans. So for us, it makes sense to be European on one side and American on the other side. So it's the right balance.
And do you see US players starting coming to France? So I know that Coursera is quite active in France because of the corporate opportunity. Are there other companies being successful and on a few markets coming from here? Or?
I think more on the corporate learning side. So Coursera is a bit active in France, Udemy as well, marketplace, really more like lifelong learning, a bit higher education, although relatively low compared to the corporate learning and lifelong learning aspect. K-12, I don't think any companies are really expanding into France. Maybe on the free user base, but not really as a market with clients in France. So it would be mostly on corporate learning and higher education. Yeah.
And what about the exit, Alex?
Well, I mean, exits have historically been somewhat of an issue across EdTech, you know, even in the States. But hopefully the wave of recent exits, you know, in the States and large funding rounds in EdTech companies from large Chinese investors, things will improve. My perspective is that a lot of the activity is going to come from private equity, you know, at least initially. There are large PE funds who are rolling up products and services, you know, across Europe. So there's HG Capital, for example, that has lots of investments in the EdTech sector and whose companies are now large enough, you know, several of their companies are now large enough to be acquirers of EdTech startups. But also really, I mean, our fund, the thesis of the fund is that we can source talent, startup talent in Europe and help them to expand globally, internationally, and that includes the US. So the exit opportunities for us are they're not exclusively European exit opportunities. They're international opportunities. So I think, you know, the tide rises with what's happening over here, and I think that if you know, as we are seeing now, more success stories in the EdTech space and more exits in the EdTech space, that will kind of buoy up the opportunities in Europe as well.
So we have 4 more minutes. What we could do is maybe conclude, and each of you could give us their feeling about the next revolution to come in your own business and from a more macro perspective. Who wants to start?
In my own business, we expect to raise money for the first time, and I'm telling to myself, I didn't come to see you, Pierre, since you have phone.
And Alex.
We talk to each other. And just an information, we are currently constructing EdTech France. That's
Association or?
Association, thank you. From 200 French EdTech entrepreneurs. So if you want to learn more about French EdTech ecosystem, if you want to come to Paris and meet with companies, EdTech companies or institutions, you can write to me and we'll arrange that for your stay in Paris.
Pierre, Sébastien?
Well, talking about the industry in general, although for sure AI and machine learning will pave the way in the future, but in the nearest future, what I see precisely is the rise of blended technology. So the subtle balance between online and physical presence. I think it's more aligned with human societies for now. So I believe that some schools will try to elaborate programs. We can see that in the US. We also did that in Europe now with the online MBA programs. But I believe that will be the way for the couple of years to come.
And I would say that the next big thing would be on vocational training in France, and to emphasize the consolidation in the market in private higher education. It's interesting to know that there are many private business schools, but also kind of private universities in France, and private equity firms are very active in that field in France and in Europe. And I think they will get more and more active in EdTech, especially, and probably buying up startup companies in EdTech, but more on the higher education, vocational training, lifelong learning, and also kind of HR and recruitment, which is actually closer and closer to higher ed and lifelong learning. So I think there might be kind of an overlap between the brick and mortar world and the EdTech companies.
We've run out of time, so I can't share my insights. But very briefly, we've seen around 20 funds in the States, and now there are 3 in Europe. So let's see what happens.
Okay, thank you to all of you.
Thank you.